My name is Isabel Hayes. And if you had asked me 10 years ago who I was, I would have smiled and said, Daniel's wife. We had the kind of love people envied on the surface. People saw the backyard barbecues, the family vacations, the 2 kids, and the beautiful brick house on Maple Drive. What they didn't see were the quiet sacrifices. The late nights I stayed up helping him draft client proposals. The years I put my own career on hold to raise our kids while he grew his law firm. The dreams I packed into boxes, one by one, so his could come true. But that's not what broke us. What broke us was silence. Started small. Forgotten date nights. Missed text messages. Work trips that stretched into weekends. Then came the changes. He started locking his phone, getting home later, acting like I was a burden. I blamed stress, burnout, midlife crisis. Gave him space. I bent until I was barely recognizable. And then, he shattered me. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I'd made chicken piccata his favorite, and the kids were still at their after-school activities. He walked in, loosened his tie, and sat down across from me at the dining room table. He didn't touch the food. Instead, he slid a manila envelope across the table with my name written on it in crisp, unfamiliar handwriting. I want a divorce, he said, his voice calm like he was ordering takeout. I thought it was a joke at first. Prank. Some cruel, tasteless attempt at dark humor. But the look in his eyes was cold. Final. There was no fight. No argument. Just facts. Daniel had prepared everything. I wasn't just blindsided emotionally. I was outmaneuvered legally. The envelope contained a prenuptial agreement I'd signed in my 20s, back when I still believed love didn't need lawyers. It also included paperwork for the house title. Apparently, he'd convinced me to sign over my share years ago during a refinancing. My name was on nothing. Not the house. Not the cars. Not even the firm, which I'd helped him build from a dusty office above a pharmacy into a thriving legal powerhouse. I want to make this as painless as possible, he said as I stared at the papers. You'll get a small monthly stipend until you find your footing. Find my footing. We had 2 teenage children, a family home, a life. And suddenly I was astray. His lawyer was brutal, efficient, everything Daniel used to admire in me. I was offered a short-term support plan and a rental property. Generous, they said, considering I didn't contribute financially. As if raising our children, managing our home, and being his unpaid business partner for a decade meant nothing. I didn't want revenge. I wanted answers. Why now? Why like this? But Daniel refused to explain. It's just time, was all he'd say. As the weeks passed, I packed my life into cardboard boxes. Every drawer I opened felt like a betrayal. Old anniversary cards, photos, notes scribbled in the margins of recipe books. Memories that meant everything to me, and apparently nothing to him. He kept the house, the firm, the reputation, and I disappeared. The rental was small, cold. The kind of place with flickering kitchen lights and doors that creaked at night. My son refused to visit. My daughter came reluctantly, always looking around like she expected a mouse to run across the floor. I started working at a local assisted living facility, changing bedpans and folding laundry. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Barely. I shrank, lost weight, lost friends, lost the illusion that kindness and loyalty would be repaid in kind. But I never lost my instinct to endure. One afternoon, while sorting medications at the facility, I saw a familiar name on a new chart. Richard Hayes. My former father-in-law. Daniel's father. The man who once called me the daughter he never had. He'd suffered a stroke and was being transferred to our care. When he arrived, I braced myself for hostility. After all, I'd been painted as the failure, the ungrateful ex-wife, the woman who couldn't handle being married to a successful man. But when Richard saw me, he didn't scowl. He smiled. "Isabel," he croaked, voice thin and raspy. "You look tired." That was it. No blame. No sarcasm. Just weary affection. Over the next few weeks, I started visiting his room during breaks. I'd bring extra pudding cups, help adjust his pillows, and sometimes just sit in silence as he stared out the window. One day, I found a note on his bedside table. His handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. "They don't know everything. You deserve better. Forgive me." I didn't ask. I didn't press. But something shifted. He started asking me questions about my life. My job, the kids, my dreams. I told him bits and pieces. He always listened carefully, even when the words came slowly for him. A week before he died, he asked me to help him with a favor. "There's a letter in the bottom drawer of my cabinet at home. Can you get it for me?" I hesitated. "Does Daniel know about it?" He gave a dry laugh. "No. And don't tell him." I shouldn't have agreed, but I did. The next day I drove to the house I used to live in, the house I decorated, cleaned, cooked in, loved in. Now it was Daniel's castle, and I was a trespasser. Nobody was home. The cabinet was in Richard's old study. Bottom drawer. Underneath old tax forms and outdated magazines, I found a sealed envelope addressed to be opened in the event of my death. Only if Isabel is present. I stared at it for a long time. Then I tucked it into my bag. 3 days later, Richard passed away quietly in his sleep. Daniel didn't call me. It was the facility director who informed me. The funeral was private. I wasn't invited. My children went without telling me. But a week later, I received a formal envelope in the mail from Grayson & Wells LLP, the Hayes family's longtime law firm. There would be a will reading. I wasn't expected to attend, but the letter in my drawer told me otherwise. The day of the will reading, I wore navy slacks and a blouse that hadn't been ironed properly. I didn't have the right clothes anymore. No pearls, no designer coat, no statement bag. But I had something none of them expected. That envelope. And the quiet dignity of a woman who had already lost everything, and therefore had nothing left to fear. The law offices of Grayson & Wells hadn't changed. Same heavy oak door. Same smell of old carpet and ink. As I stepped into the waiting room, the receptionist did a double take. "I'm here for the will reading," I said, steadying my voice. She blinked. Ms. Hayes. You're not on the list. Check again. Isabel Hayes." I pulled the envelope from my bag, its seal still intact. "Mr. Richard Hayes left something. It says I'm supposed to be here." She disappeared behind a door. I could hear voices from the conference room. Familiar ones. Daniel. His sister Lorraine. Their family attorney Mr. Aldridge, with his gravelly tone and old-school mannerisms. The door opened. Mr. Aldridge appeared, eyebrows raised. "Well, this is unexpected." His gaze landed on the letter in my hand. But not unwelcome. He held out his hand. I gave him the envelope. He didn't open it. He simply nodded and gestured toward the conference room. When I walked in, Daniel's head snapped around. "What is she doing here?" he barked, already half standing. Lorraine narrowed her eyes, her lips twitching into a bitter smile. "You must be lost, sweetheart. The ex-wives support group meets across the street." "I'm here because your father wanted me here," I replied evenly. I looked directly at Daniel. "Sit down," Mr. Aldridge said, more to Daniel than to me. Richard left very clear instructions. Daniel gave me a look I knew well. The look of a man caught off guard, and furious about it. I sat at the far end of the table, away from the folder of estate documents spread out near Daniel's elbow. I didn't belong at that table anymore. But I was there. Mr. Aldridge began with the basics. Richard Hayes had passed with a net estate of approximately $12.4 million, excluding properties. He had a living trust, a business succession plan, and 1 son and 1 daughter as primary beneficiaries. Everything was expected to go to Daniel and Lorraine, until Mr. Aldridge opened my envelope. He removed a single-page handwritten letter. He read it silently, his expression tightening. Then, after a long pause, he cleared his throat. This letter was written by Mr. Richard Hayes 1 week prior to his death, and left in my care under specific instructions. I was to open it only if Isabel Hayes was physically present at the reading of his will. He turned the page over, scanned the back, then looked up. "Would you all like me to read this aloud?" Daniel let out a dry laugh. "Oh, for God's sake. Just get on with it." Mr. Aldridge began reading. "To whom it may concern, and especially to my children. If Isabel is in the room, then that means she honored her promise. She found the letter I asked her to retrieve. She did what none of you would have done for me, and what few of you would have done for her. There are truths you've chosen to ignore, things you've done in silence or shadows, and it's time for those things to come into the light. I am revising my will with the following codicil." At this, Daniel's posture stiffened. "I leave the cabin property in Bear Ridge, the 40% minority shares in Hayes and Kent Law, and the vintage vehicle collection to Isabel Hayes, not as charity but as repayment for her loyalty, her integrity, her role in building what many of you pretended she had no part in. I am aware that the firm was partially funded by Isabel's inheritance from her late mother. I am aware of the documents Daniel had her sign, under the guise of refinancing, that transferred ownership of her own marital property to him. And I am aware that my son did these things knowingly, callously, and without remorse. This is my way of correcting in death what I failed to intervene in during life. Isabel, forgive me." The room fell so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Daniel's face flushed deep red. "This is absurd," he said. Mr. Aldridge shook his head. "It's notarized, witnessed, and filed." His instructions were clear. "These assets now belong to Ms. Hayes. You can't be serious. She's my ex-wife." Mr. Aldridge raised a brow. "Precisely why she's receiving them." Mr. Hayes knew the extent of the damage done. And more importantly, he knew the value she contributed. Lorraine leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "I didn't even know he owned 40% of the firm," I whispered. "You were never meant to," Aldridge said softly. "But he always intended you to inherit it. He told me once. She built that firm, brick by brick. It's hers as much as his." When the reading ended, I stood slowly. My hands trembled, but I didn't let them see. Daniel followed me into the hallway. "You think this makes us even?" he hissed. "No," I replied. "Nothing ever will. But this gives me a beginning." He scoffed. "You're not going to win. I'll fight this." I met his eyes. "You already lost." The 40% stake in the firm made headlines in our small town. The firm's partners, previously unaware of the silent ownership, were furious. They offered to buy me out. I declined. Instead, I hired my own legal team. And this time I chose wisely. We began investigating the legality of Daniel's asset transfers during our marriage, especially the ones he'd rushed through right before serving the divorce papers. And that's when we found it. Daniel had forged 2 notary signatures on financial disclosure documents. It wasn't just a moral failure. It was fraud. I didn't want revenge, but I wanted justice. My attorneys filed a civil case. The media got wind of it. Clients began distancing themselves from the Hayes name. And quietly I started building again. The cabin at Bear Ridge was nothing like the sterile homes Daniel used to love. It was warm, wood-paneled, perched above a frozen lake that shimmered in the morning sun. Inside, Richard had left something else, a box. In it were old photos. One of me and the kids playing in the snow. One of Richard and me fishing. And one of all of us at a firm's first-year anniversary party. Me holding a champagne glass, laughter in my eyes. There was also a note. "You were never invisible. Not to me. Not ever." I moved into the cabin. I began offering legal consulting to women going through similar betrayals. Quietly, without fanfare. And when my daughter came to visit one weekend, standing in the doorway with tears in her eyes, she said something I'll never forget. "Mom, I'm proud of you." Winter melted into spring on Bear Ridge. The snow outside the cabin began to thin. The lake's frozen sheet cracked into pieces, breaking apart like the life I'd once lived, and quietly making room for something new. Each morning I'd sit on the small front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the mist lift from the water. It was the first time in years that my breath didn't feel heavy in my chest. The silence here wasn't the suffocating silence of a cold marriage or an empty house. It was peace. I was building again, but this time for me. She arrived with a suitcase full of receipts and eyes full of fear. "Rebecca," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, I thought this was just a cabin." "It is," I smiled. "But I also do a little work here." "Tell me everything." She was 54. Married to a man who'd quietly emptied their joint accounts, left her for a much younger woman, and made her believe she deserved it. Sound familiar? By the time she left, she had a legal strategy, 3 referrals, and a file labeled Rebecca's Comeback. Word spread. Quietly. One woman told another. And another. I wasn't just rebuilding a life. I was helping other women do the same. When the audit confirmed Daniel had forged financial disclosures and misrepresented marital assets, my legal team advised pressing charges. Not to get back at him. To protect the truth. The case was civil but heavy with consequence. If the judge ruled in my favor, Daniel could face both public humiliation and criminal referral. And on a rainy Tuesday morning, we stood across from each other in court. Me in a charcoal gray suit borrowed from a friend. Him in a perfectly tailored navy ensemble, fidgeting with his cufflinks. He looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just taller now. My attorney walked me through the paper trail. The missing accounts. The altered documents. Then came the letter. Richard's letter. The court admitted it as evidence to establish motive. And betrayal. But what struck the courtroom silent wasn't the legal jargon. It was the part where Richard wrote. I watched Daniel convince Isabel to sign over her share of the house. I told him to stop. He said she'd never question it. That she trusted him too much. That's when I knew he was no longer the man I raised. Daniel turned white. For the first time since the divorce, I saw regret flash across his face. Not because he hurt me, but because he was losing control of the narrative. The judge ruled in my favor. The forged documents invalidated the property transfers. The house, the one on Maple Drive, was deemed joint marital property after all. The court awarded me 50% equity, and a share of the business profits dating back 5 years. Daniel's reputation crumbled in slow motion. Local papers picked up the story. His name disappeared from conference panels. Clients pulled out. He had taken everything in the divorce. Now it was my turn to take back what was mine. Weeks later he called me. I let it go to voicemail. "Isabel," he said. "I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I was doing what I had to do. I didn't expect you to fight like this. I thought you'd disappear." I almost laughed. Disappearing was the one thing I refused to do again. My daughter came up to the cabin one Saturday with her brother in tow. He'd avoided me for months after the divorce. Daniel had poisoned his mind with stories. But time has a way of revealing who people really are. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said at the edge of the lake, eyes watery. "I should have asked you what happened. I should have come to see you." I pulled him into a hug. Held him longer than I probably should have. We didn't talk about Daniel. We didn't need to. A year after the will reading, I stepped into the conference room of Hayes and Kent for the first time since my name had been erased from its history. The partners sat at a long table. Some were wary, others curious. I wore the same navy slacks I'd worn to the will reading. This time they were pressed and tailored. I placed the ownership documents on the table. "I'm not here to play games," I said. "But I am here to have a seat." They offered me one. I didn't ask for power. I asked for transparency. And I got it. One quiet evening at the cabin, I pulled out a worn envelope I hadn't opened yet. It was the original letter Richard left at his bedside before he passed. I had been too scared to read it until now. Inside was a simple, handwritten note. Isabel. Failed you. I saw what Daniel was becoming and I stayed quiet. I thought it was just a phase. But then I realized, silence can be as loud as betrayal. I've been watching you for years, quietly. Your kindness, your endurance, your quiet loyalty. You were the best thing to ever happen to this family. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. But I hope this letter and what I've left you is a beginning, not an apology. You have always been enough. Asterisk. Richard cried, not out of pain, but because someone had finally seen me. Months later, I drove past the house on Maple Drive. Daniel was moving out. He stood on the lawn, watching as movers carried out box after box. His second wife had left him. His firm had dissolved into smaller factions. And now, even the house was no longer his. He saw my car. Slowed. He nodded once. Just once. Not a plea. Not a thank you. Just a man realizing he bet wrong on the one person who had always bet on him. I didn't go back to the city. I didn't reclaim old titles or chase the spotlight. Instead, I built something better. At Bear Ridge, I started a quiet initiative. A legal advice program for women left behind. Twice a month, women came with tear-streaked faces, broken papers, or just broken hearts. And I gave them the one thing they thought they'd lost. A way forward. One evening, my daughter sat beside me on the porch. The lake shimmered gold in the setting sun. "Do you ever wish it all hadn't happened?" she asked. Thought about it. About the nights I cried on the bathroom floor. About the loss. The humiliation. The betrayal. "No," I finally said. "If he hadn't taken everything, I wouldn't have realized I didn't need any of it to begin again. He took everything in the divorce. But in the end, the one thing he forgot was that sometimes the people we silence are the ones who speak the loudest in the end. And that one forgotten letter gave me back everything, and more." Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story and tell us where you're watching from.